so pleased to be joined by my friend, Steve Schwartz. He runs the blog and the podcast and the YouTube channel for LSAT Unplugged. And today we're going to be doing a little bit of a collab where he interviews me about my journey going to law school, and I get to interview him a bit about his journey being an LSAT coach. So stick around for both of the videos and we'll hop right into it. All right. So, hey, Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm excited to have you on the channel.
Thanks for having me, Nicole. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I was hoping I could just ask you a couple questions about your journey to becoming an LSAT coach, your experiences doing that. I mean, just jumping right in, what led you to choose this as a career path?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I never actually consciously made the choice to do this. I kind of fell into it. I was considering law school myself, of course, which is why I got into the LSAT, because most people don't do this for fun. And it ended up being not very much fun at all. I started off with scores in the low 150s when I had dreams of a top 14. And it was really disheartening to start off with those initial low scores. And I kind of used that as fuel and became obsessed with the process of mastering this exam. And over an excruciatingly long period of time, what ended up being over the course of an entire year, I gradually raised my score to a 175.
Oh, wow.
It was a huge increase, but it didn't really feel very sudden during the process. But once I got there, friends started asking me for help with it. And I had tutored other subjects in the past. So I started tutoring and coaching the LSAT as well. Mm-hmm. And then when it came time to apply to law school, I realized that that wasn't really what I had ever wanted to do. Mm-hmm. I'd always been kind of ambivalent about it and kind of had this lack of certainty about my future career prospects after graduating college. And so since I was already coaching the LSAT, I decided to kind of just keep doing that for a while and delay my law school applications, and then never ended up going. And now over 10 years later, I've got the blog and the website and the podcast and all that. So it's kind of just snowballed bit by bit. And that brings me to where I am today. And I love it. I love what I do.
So you never actually ended up applying to law school?
No, I never even applied. It's funny. I wrote a personal statement, but it kind of ended up being all about why I didn't want to go to law school, really.
Oh my gosh.
It ended up being more negative than positive. And I showed it to my brother and he was like, it sounds like you don't want to go to law school. And I was like, maybe I don't. But I loved the LSAT and I loved doing that. And I loved the website. And then the podcast and YouTube came later. They kind of grew out of it. But it became this journey of just going deeper and deeper into the formulas and underlying structure of the LSAT.
Yeah. So is the LSAT test itself the reason that you love your job, or are there other aspects to what you do for a career now?
Well, I love the exam. I think it's super complex and more interesting and more deep every time I look at it. Mm-hmm. But I also love the students. I love working with folks one-on-one. I love hearing from folks who listen to the podcast or read the website or anything in between. So I think the human interaction is a lot of what makes this fun. If I were just studying the LSAT in some dark corner, not ever talking to anybody, it wouldn't really be the same. So I think the interactivity plus the exam itself is what really makes it special for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. I had to ask you, have you actually paid to sit and take the LSAT in the last 10 years?
Yeah, I have. I did. I mean, that's how I got my score. I sat down and I took it. I took it a couple of times at various test centers throughout New York. So yeah, I had been through the process. And of course, it's very different doing this on your own in your apartment or in a coffee shop when you know it's not for real, versus whatever happens that day, you're going to have the score on record. It'll live on forever. And of course, you can cancel if you want, but there's definitely a different level of stress when you're surrounded by other students who you're competing with in a way, and then the proctors who can be really annoying as they pace around the room.
Have you heard any LSAT horror stories from students who have tried it and just for one reason or another, something went terribly wrong? I know for me, when I took the LSAT, there was this one kid who sat right next to me who breathed so heavy for an hour. It was just okay, what is this logic game? I'm oh my gosh, dude, I gotta go to law school here. You gotta calm down.
No, it's crazy. I mean, you can't control the environment. Of course, you can try to control how you react to things and mitigate whatever might come up or its impact on you. But yeah, test centers, really anything at all can happen. I mean, like I said, the proctors pacing around if they're wearing loud, high-heeled shoes, or if they're chewing gum or something, that can get really annoying. Fellow test takers can also be a problem, but I think there are a couple of things that come into play. One of them is distractions. So let's say the fire alarm goes off, there's a marching band outside. Those things really do happen, and there's not much you can do about it. Then there's this other thing I heard about where the proctors, you can't bring a cell phone to the LSAT. It's not allowed due to security concerns. And I heard one case where a test center, the proctors asked everyone who brought a cell phone with them to bring it to the front of the room, implying they would hold it for you. And then everyone who brought a cell phone was automatically kicked out right away. So they tricked them. It was, I consider that entrapment, but
yeah, that doesn't feel loud.
That didn't feel right to me, but they were enforcing the rules. And so those sorts of things can happen. And then on the more mundane end, you have things like the desk being too small, or maybe they don't let you bring in something you were expecting to be able to bring in, like a snack or a bottle of water, or maybe your name on your admission ticket doesn't match your ID. Sure. And so some of those things are preventable, but you've really got to be ready for anything.
Yeah, for sure. Something you mentioned a little earlier that I wanted to ask you about, because it was a question I had when I took the LSAT. Thankfully, I didn't feel like I needed to take advantage of the option to cancel my score. But I know that that's something people have talked about of, is this something that you really should consider? How do you know when that's something you want to do? Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's a great question, Nicole. So canceling your score, it gives students a lot of stress, not knowing what your score would be before you have to make that choice. But the good news is that law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores. There's a lot of outdated information online about this. They made the change back in 2006 from averaging multiple scores to only considering the highest. So there's really very little reason to ever cancel unless you feel that something went horribly wrong out of the ordinary. So that's the example of the fire alarm going off, or the marching band outside, or the proctors totally screwing up the timing. Those are all cases where canceling might be warranted. But if you just have this vague sense of unease that something went not as well as it could have, or the person next to you was a little bit mildly annoying, or maybe one question didn't go as well as it could have, those are cases where I'd say canceling isn't really worth it. Who knows? You might surprise yourself. You might have done better than you expected. There are people who consider canceling, don't, and then end up scoring 170 plus.
Wow.
And since law schools don't average multiple scores, there's really not much downside to having a relatively lower score on record if you're going to retake anyway.
Sure. When do you advise a student to retake versus not? Because obviously that's a lot of time, energy, a lot of money to retake a test. Maybe if you're aiming for a 1, I don't know, my goal, like my bottom minimum, whatever, cutoff point was a 167. And so I was like, okay, if I don't get a 167, I'm retaking it. I don't care. Is that something that's advisable that you see a lot of people doing, or is there another strategy to kind of get around that?
I think that's reasonable. I think a 167 also is a good target score to meet or exceed, because that puts you in a competitive running for the top 14, depending on what your GPA is, of course. And so I want you to look at, what are your target schools? What are your reach schools? Your GPA is probably already set in stone at this point, but your LSAT score is not. And so you can play around. There's a website, actually LSAC has a website, like an LSAC GPA calculator, and you can plug in your LSAT score and your GPA and then see what your odds would be at various law schools, given their medians of their previous matriculating class, and then see how you stack up. And that's a good way to think about it. But as far as deciding whether to retake or not, you want to consider, how much time will you have to study over the next several weeks or months until your target test date? And do you think you can do better? What can you do differently next time around that you didn't do previously? So maybe if your work schedule was busy or your class schedule was busy, maybe you can reduce those workloads a bit so you can increase time devoted to the LSAT. Or let's say you might have a vacation coming up or family obligations. If you can work around those and put in the time, then you stand a chance at doing better next time around. Or maybe if you didn't use the right resources previously, you didn't use enough real exams or didn't do enough real exams, and you can change something for the future. If you can modify your study plan and your schedule, then it's worth it. It's worth giving it another shot. The LSAT weighs more heavily than any other factor in law school admissions, but it all comes down to just that one day. And of course, the weeks and months leading up to it. But in comparison, your GPA it's the culmination of 3 or 4 or more years of work. And so it's worth giving the LSAT, relatively equal investment. And I'm not saying to study for it for 3 to 4 years, but I would treat it like a 6-credit class in college over the period of 3 to 4 months at least. Most people don't spend enough time studying for this. They'll do it in 2 to 3 months because that's what traditional prep classes timelines are like. But I think the LSAT's worth more than that. So if you can invest the time, it's worth it. And that could also get you into a better school or can get you more scholarship money. And so the time investment and the money investment of, let's say, $200 for the LSAT registration and then several hours of time investment, it still is worth it when you consider that you could get $10,000, $20,000 in scholarships or get into a better school.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that you talked a little bit about made me think of the fact that almost every single pre-law student or law student that I've interacted with is very much like the overachiever, type A personality. You said, oh, maybe you didn't study enough or maybe you didn't have the right studying materials. I feel like even somebody who gets you could probably attest to this, even somebody who gets in the 170s, I feel like could still feel that way on the big day of, oh, well, maybe I could get another 2 points if I study for another 4 months. Do you feel like that's worth that investment when you've already maybe improved, say, 10 to 15 points and you've done a good job? Is there any kind of cap on when you should be happy with your score, satisfied with the work you did, and kind of move on with your application from there?
That's a great question. So there's a couple pieces to it. One of them is that even if you can improve a single point or two more, it's crazy to say this, but just a single point or two could make the difference between a yes or a no in getting accepted. And then it can make the difference in another $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 in scholarship money. It's nuts that just one little number can make the difference, but it's real. That's how it works because law school admission officers, they have to consider the rankings, the U.S. News rankings, which are ever important, despite the fact that they have a lot of problems, but their jobs rest on that. And so that weighs into whether they accept you or not, or whether they have scholarship money that they can afford to give you or not. And so if it takes another 3 or 4 months of studying, but gives you $20,000 more per year or gets you into a top 14 versus when you wouldn't have gotten in otherwise, the ROI over the course of your career could make that worth it, even if it seems crazy to think about. Then the other side of this is that studying harder versus studying right. So people, type A personalities, overachievers, they might do exam after exam after exam. There's 86 numbered exams right now. You could do all of them and measure your results and obsess over them with spreadsheets and such. But the question becomes, are you getting insights out of that work, or is it more of a churn and burn strategy? So you could study smarter next time around, and that alone could unlock the difference. And then 1 or 2 points more in the 170s can be huge, especially if you're going from 169 to 170. That's a lot different than going from a 151 to a 152.
Sure. I personally, when I hit a 169, I was like, this is good for me. This is where I'm feeling like I'm going to get into the schools that I want with the scholarship and the competition that I want. And so I decided not to retake it. So I'm interested by your answer to that question because I feel like it's so dependent on the goals of the test taker. Because I'm sure that if I, studied for another 6 months, took it again in September, I took mine in June last year, I probably could have gotten into the 170, 171 range. But for me, it didn't feel like worth it for where I wanted to be. And I'm actually most likely going to be going to a top 20 school with a full ride and living stipend at a 169. So what would you say to maybe a student like me or somebody who's taking practice tests in that range? Would the same advice apply?
Yeah, well, the fact that I assume that maybe your GPA was pretty good if you're looking at top 20s with a full ride, right?
Yeah, I hope so.
So that's one piece of it. If your GPA was significantly lower than the medians, then the LSAT score has more importance placed upon it.
Sure.
The other thing I can say is that there's a margin of error. There's a score band of 3.5 points now on either end. So let's say you got a 169. That could be a 172.5 or 173. Let's say next time you took it, even if everything else remained the same, could be a 166 on another day, even if everything else remained the same. So let's say someone looking into the future right now, they're thinking about taking it in June this year. You could take it in June and then take it 6 weeks later in mid-July and not even do much, if any, studying between June and July. But just by random luck of the draw, you could do 3 or 4 points better. And so I would say maybe you just do a timed exam a week over the course of those 6 weeks. You could do 3 points better. And if you don't, so what? Law schools will still only take the highest. So a retake doesn't necessarily require a ton of extra work if you already have a strong foundation. But to speak on the other side in terms of not retaking, you don't want to be a perfectionist. This is one of those things where it's like a piece of writing. Writing is never perfect, right? You just decide that it's good enough, and then you walk away and move on with your life.
Yeah.
But you could polish the same 500-word essay for years and years and years if you want. And
been there.
and you could obsess over word choice and use the thesaurus and have editors and folks read it over and such. But at a certain point, you decide, you know what, this is good enough, and you move on with your life. You know, it's funny. I was talking with a law career expert the other day, and she was talking about how you want to carve out half an hour a day for networking. And so if you're obsessing over the LSAT, you're not doing that networking work, or you're not working on your personal statement. You're getting your letters of recommendation in line. So there's lots of other things to do in life aside from the LSAT, and not everybody needs to get a perfect 180 to move on to law school, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really great way to look at it. I kind of want to back off a little bit in the nitty gritties that we've been talking about, and touch on just the mindset that LSAT takes in general. What would you say is the quickest way for somebody to get into the mindset and the point of view, perspective of what it takes to master the LSAT to get where they want to be, the goal score that they have? What shift needs to take place for that studying to be effective and efficient?
That's a great question. I think that a lot of the LSAT comes down to having a critical and skeptical mindset. So that means that you're evaluating arguments and not taking what people say at face value. So you always want to be asking, how could the evidence be true? How could the given information be valid, yet the conclusion not logically follow from that? So you want to, in a way, problematize people's statements. And those could be friends and family, significant others and such. You wouldn't necessarily want to point these things out to them because they'll get mad at you. But it's worth evaluating how something could be true, yet a conclusion not follow based on that. So let's say, my favorite example is, let's say that a restaurant has a 5-star rating on Yelp, and someone says, therefore, we should go to that restaurant. And you might want to ask, how could a restaurant have a 5-star rating, yet that not warrant us going there for dinner? And you could say maybe the rating is fake. Maybe they only have one review. Maybe we don't like the cuisine. Maybe the place is not conveniently located. So there are lots of ways that the restaurant could have that 5-star rating, yet the conclusion that we should go there does not automatically follow from that. And the LSAT has, of course, more complex arguments on topics that we might not be familiar with or what we might not like. And so that also requires us to bring a little bit more curiosity to the table in terms of how we engage with it in the first place. How can we dumb it down and make it more relatable? And that's a skill you develop over time, of course. It's easier to do on the easier questions, and it takes some time to get there on the tougher ones. But that's kind of the mindset I bring to it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that advice. One more question for you, and then we'll let you go, and I'll direct people over to your channel for all the other awesome advice that you give. What is the number one question, not that you're asked by your students, but that you wish you were asked?
Wow, that's a great question. I got to think about that for a minute. I wish people asked me more about what to do aside from doing LSAT problems, like doing sections or doing exams, because people are always asking me, which exams should I do, or which timed sections should I complete? Like, should I do test 74's logic games or test 73's logical reasoning? And I feel like that's not the right question to ask, because it's all good. It's all good practice. It's all, as long as you're doing a real LSAT prep test, it's all good material. What people don't ask enough about is what to do after they complete the problems. What should the review process look like? And the review process should take just as long, if not longer, than doing the actual problems in the first place. And so I wish people would ask me more about how to engage with the questions on a deeper level in the kind of the post-game analysis. And so I could briefly touch on what that looks like.
Yeah, please.
I want students to look for what was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made them pick it, and what ultimately makes it wrong. And then on the flip side, what's discouraging about the right answer choice that pushes them away from it, and what ultimately makes it correct. And actually write this out. Either type it or write it out by hand, or explain to a friend or a tutor or a coach or someone who is willing to listen. I had one student who was talking to a philosophy major friend of hers, and he was able to engage pretty well with her on that stuff. And so you can find people, or you can go online as well, but really just having that actual discussion or articulating it for yourself, I think is really where so much of the progress comes from. And of course, I have examples of this that my students have done, and I have videos walking through it as well. But that's really where I think students should be focusing more of their time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate you coming on, sharing that advice. You guys, I will make sure to link all of Steve's stuff down in the description below, as well as some of the resources that he mentioned, including LSAT's grade and GPA and LSAT number calculator, so you can see kind of the percentage of likelihood of you getting into certain schools that you were aiming for. Steve really helped me out a lot just through his blog before he even knew me or talked to me in my process, which I've mentioned before in my first video. So make sure to check that out. I'll link all that stuff for you below. I'll see you guys next time. God bless.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.